The story of Germany during World War II is often told through the lens of its leaders, battles, and sweeping political movements, but hidden within this history are the quiet, courageous acts of those who resisted from within. These were ordinary men and women, caught in a society gripped by fear and propaganda, who made the extraordinary choice to fight against the regime that had taken control of their country. Their struggle was not fought on the open battlefield, but in the shadows, in whispered conversations, in hidden leaflets, in clandestine networks, and in acts of defiance that carried the heaviest of risks. The German resistance was not a single organized movement, nor was it unified under a single ideology or strategy. It was a mosaic of individuals and small groups who shared a common conviction that the crimes being committed in their nation were intolerable, that the moral duty to oppose evil outweighed the dangers to their own lives. Among these were military officers, civil servants, students, religious leaders, intellectuals, and even ordinary citizens whose courage would echo through history. Each played a role, whether subtle or overt, in challenging the machinery of tyranny from within. In the early years of the regime, the scope of resistance was limited, often fragmented, and difficult to sustain. Fear of arrest, torture, and death hung over the population like a dark cloud. The regime's security apparatus, ever vigilant, sought out dissent with ruthless efficiency, leaving very little room for open opposition. Yet even in these conditions, sparks of defiance emerged. Intellectuals circulated clandestine writings that criticized the government. Students and professors quietly discussed the moral failures of the state, and some members of the military began questioning orders that violated their conscience. These small acts, often imperceptible to the public, laid the foundation for more organized efforts in later years. One of the most famous examples of the military resistance was Operation Valkyrie, a daring plot orchestrated by a group of officers within the German army who sought to assassinate Hitler and seize control of the government in order to prevent further destruction. Klaus Stauffenberg, a charismatic and determined officer, became the face of this operation. The plan relied on careful coordination, deception, and extreme precision. In July 1944, Stauffenberg placed a briefcase containing explosives near Hitler during a meeting at the Wolfslair. The bomb exploded, killing 4 people and injuring several others, but Hitler survived. The failure of the assassination was catastrophic for the conspirators. Within hours, arrests swept through military and civilian circles, and many were executed. Despite this, the courage and conviction displayed in the attempt revealed the existence of principled opposition within the heart of the German military. Resistance, however, was not confined to military officers. Ordinary citizens, motivated by conscience and morality, found ways to oppose the regime through smaller yet no less significant acts. Families sheltered those being persecuted, workers sabotaged production lines that contributed to the war effort, and communities circulated information from foreign broadcasts that contradicted state propaganda. Each act carried immense risk. Discovery meant imprisonment, torture, and often death. Yet for these individuals, silence was a betrayal of humanity itself. They chose to act, even when the consequences were dire, and in doing so, demonstrated the profound strength of the human spirit in the face of oppression. Religious institutions also played a role in resisting the regime, offering moral guidance and practical support to those in danger. Some clergy members spoke out against policies that violated human dignity, risking arrest for their defiance. Certain churches provided sanctuary, hid refugees, or facilitated escape routes for those being targeted. These acts of conscience, while small in scale, reflected a moral opposition that contrasted sharply with the ideology propagated by the state. The resistance also manifested in the form of intellectual and cultural opposition. Writers, artists, and academics circulated forbidden literature, produced clandestine newsletters, and engaged in quiet debates that challenged the dominant narrative. While these efforts rarely threatened the regime's immediate power, they preserved the idea that an alternative moral and political vision existed, one that valued justice, freedom, and human dignity over fear and oppression. Despite their courage, the resistance faced extraordinary challenges. The state's surveillance apparatus was extensive, and informants were everywhere. Trust was a dangerous commodity. Betrayal could come from neighbors, colleagues, or even family members. Maintaining secrecy required extraordinary discipline, and the constant threat of discovery weighed heavily on those involved. Yet even under such circumstances, the human drive to resist injustice persisted, creating networks that, while often short-lived, left an enduring legacy of courage and moral clarity. As the war drew to a close, many of these resistors paid the ultimate price, their lives cut short, their efforts suppressed. Yet their legacy persisted. In post-war Germany, the memory of these individuals became a touchstone for moral reflection and historical understanding. Monuments, memoirs, and academic studies would later honor their bravery, ensuring that their resistance was neither forgotten nor in vain. The German resistance is a testament to the enduring human capacity to confront injustice, even when the odds are overwhelmingly against success. It illustrates that courage is not only measured by victory on the battlefield, but also by the willingness to stand for what is right in the most perilous circumstances. It is a story that resonates beyond its historical moment, offering lessons in moral integrity, personal responsibility, and the profound impact that individual and collective courage can have, even in the darkest chapters of history. Germany in the early 1930s was a nation teetering on the edge of despair. The scars of the First World War were still raw, etched not only into the physical landscape of the country, but into the hearts and minds of its people. Cities were struggling to rebuild, families were struggling to survive, and the economy was a patchwork of instability, inflation, and unemployment. Every day seemed to be a reminder of the humiliation and hardship imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. For many Germans, the future looked bleak, and the past seemed inescapable. In this climate of uncertainty and frustration, the seeds of radical change were planted, and a movement emerged that promised revival, pride, and national unity. Yet even as the regime gained influence, there were individuals who questioned its promises, who saw danger lurking behind the slogans of national rebirth. Resistance in Germany did not begin with large-scale plots or dramatic acts of defiance. It began quietly, subtly, in the minds and hearts of people who refused to surrender their moral compass. Intellectuals, students, clergy, and civil servants began to voice, in the smallest of ways, their doubts and concerns. They wrote essays that critiqued government policies, circulated pamphlets and leaflets in secret, and engaged in discussions that challenged the official narrative. Every word, every act of questioning was a risk in a society that increasingly demanded conformity and obedience. Among these early resistors were the intellectuals of Germany's universities. Professors risked their positions and even their lives by teaching ideas that ran counter to the dominant ideology. Some, like the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, began to recognize the moral bankruptcy of the government's policies, particularly in regard to the treatment of targeted groups. Bonhoeffer's writings during this period reveal a man wrestling with questions of faith, ethics, and duty in a society that demanded complicity. He and others like him became quietly involved in networks that would later play significant roles in organized resistance. Students, too, were among the first to push back, though their methods were often limited by the dangers surrounding them. In classrooms and dormitories, they debated the morality of the regime's policies, discussed the implications of propaganda, and shared information that challenged the official narrative. These discussions, while seemingly small, were profound acts of courage. To question the state in any way was to risk surveillance, denunciation, and punishment. But for these students, silence was a betrayal of their conscience, and speaking, even in whispers, was a necessary assertion of humanity. Civil servants and bureaucrats, often overlooked in histories of resistance, also played an important role. Some quietly subverted orders, delayed harmful policies, or protected vulnerable individuals from the worst consequences of state action. Their acts were not always dramatic, and they rarely made headlines, but they represent a subtle and persistent form of resistance that kept alive a sense of moral integrity within the machinery of government. The early years of opposition were also marked by efforts to document and preserve the truth. As propaganda spread and the regime sought to control information, clandestine networks emerged to circulate forbidden literature, preserve historical records, and maintain lines of communication with foreign allies. These networks were fragile, vulnerable to infiltration and discovery, yet they became the backbone of later, more organized resistance movements. Each document circulated, each secret message sent, was a small victory against the suffocating control of the state. Religious institutions provided another critical avenue of opposition. Churches became places where moral guidance could be given, where communities could gather and find reassurance, and where those who opposed injustice could receive support. These acts of courage, often quiet and understated, contributed to a moral resistance that stood in stark contrast to the coercion and brutality of the government. Among the most remarkable aspects of early resistance was the diversity of those involved. People from all walks of life, students, teachers, clergy, civil servants, workers, and ordinary citizens, found ways to oppose injustice, however small or risky. Their motivations varied, from moral and ethical convictions to political beliefs and personal experiences. Yet they shared a common understanding that standing by silently in the face of wrongdoing was unacceptable. The methods of resistance in this period were necessarily subtle. Pamphlets, letters, clandestine meetings, and quiet acts of defiance were the tools available to those willing to risk everything. These efforts required ingenuity, courage, and discipline. To circulate a forbidden pamphlet, to speak a truth in a whisper, or to quietly protect someone targeted by the state was to make a profound statement of personal integrity. Even in these early years, the risks were real and severe. Surveillance was constant, informants were everywhere, and the penalties for dissent could include imprisonment, torture, or execution. Families lived under the shadow of fear, and the consequences of discovery extended beyond the individual to their loved ones. Yet despite the dangers, the human drive to resist persisted, fueled by conscience, morality, and the recognition that evil could not go unchallenged. The early resistance also faced profound ethical questions. How far could one go in opposition without endangering innocent lives? How could one act effectively in a society dominated by fear and intimidation? These dilemmas were not theoretical. They shaped the decisions of every resistor, influencing who participated, how they acted, and what risks they were willing to take. The moral complexity of these choices is part of what makes the story of resistance so compelling. As the 1930s progressed, these early seeds of defiance would lay the foundation for more organized efforts. Networks began to link individuals across regions, connecting those who shared a commitment to opposing the regime. Communication remained a critical challenge, as the risk of interception was constant, yet these connections allowed ideas, strategies, and moral support to flow between resistors. Each link in the network represented both hope and danger, a testament to the determination and bravery of those involved. While these acts of resistance were largely invisible at the time, their impact cannot be underestimated. They preserved the notion that opposition was possible, that moral agency could survive even in a society dominated by fear. They created a framework for the later, more dramatic acts of defiance that would capture the attention of history. It is essential to recognize that the early resistance was not monolithic. There was no single organization, no unified strategy, no common ideology. Instead, it was a mosaic of individuals and small groups, each operating according to their conscience, their understanding of justice, and their assessment of risk. This diversity was both a strength and a challenge, as coordination was difficult, but it also ensured that opposition existed in multiple forms and sectors of society. Among those who would later become central figures in resistance were individuals whose early actions exemplified courage and foresight. Clergy like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, students who would form the White Rose, and civil servants who quietly subverted harmful orders all began their work during this period. Their stories remind us that resistance is rarely immediate or grandiose. It often begins with small, quiet choices, with acts of moral integrity that ripple outward over time. The political and social context of Germany in these years cannot be ignored. The regime's consolidation of power was methodical and pervasive. Propaganda saturated every aspect of daily life, education was aligned with state ideology, and dissent was ruthlessly punished.
Yet even in this environment, pockets of opposition survived, nurtured by moral conviction, courage, and the determination to act for what is right. These pockets became the seeds from which later, more organized resistance would grow. In understanding the early resistance, it is also important to recognize the role of information and communication. Foreign broadcasts, clandestine newspapers, and whispered conversations became lifelines for those seeking truth. The ability to access alternative sources of information allowed resistors to maintain perspective, make informed decisions, and connect with like-minded individuals. The struggle for knowledge was in itself an act of defiance, a refusal to be fully controlled by the state's narrative. By the end of the 1930s, Germany was on the brink of global conflict. The invasion of Poland in 1939 would mark the beginning of World War II, and the moral urgency for resistance would intensify. The early efforts of resistors, intellectual, moral, and practical, laid the groundwork for the more organized and daring acts that would follow. They demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming fear and control, the human spirit could assert its independence, its conscience, and its determination to act for what is right. The story of Germany's early resistance is not merely historical. It is a testament to the power of moral courage, the resilience of conscience, and the capacity of individuals to challenge oppression in even the most perilous circumstances. It is a story of hope, defiance, and the enduring belief that one person's commitment to justice can resonate far beyond their immediate actions.
As the 1930s gave way to the outbreak of war in 1939, the urgency of resistance within Germany escalated. The invasion of Poland marked not only the beginning of a global conflict, but also a profound moral turning point for those who had quietly opposed the regime. The acts of conscience that had persisted in universities, churches, and bureaucracies now faced a more immediate and dangerous context. The machinery of war brought with it not only vast destruction abroad, but atrocities at home and in occupied territories that could no longer be ignored. For some, especially within the military, the realization dawned that passive opposition was no longer sufficient. Action was required. Within the ranks of the German military, a remarkable and morally complex resistance began to take shape. These were men who had sworn oaths of loyalty to the state and its armed forces, yet found themselves increasingly at odds with the orders they were given, the policies they were asked to enforce, and the crimes they witnessed. Their opposition was not born of external pressures, but from an acute awareness of ethical responsibility. Among the most famous of these resistors was Klaus von Stauffenberg, a charismatic and intelligent officer whose dedication to duty was matched only by his moral conviction. Stauffenberg's path to resistance was shaped by his personal experiences on the battlefield, where he witnessed the human cost of blind obedience, and by his growing understanding of the atrocities committed under the regime's command. The resistance within the military was highly organized, yet necessarily secretive. Officers could not openly oppose the leadership without risking immediate arrest and execution. Therefore, clandestine networks formed, operating with utmost discretion, relying on trust, coded communication, and meticulous planning. These officers sought not merely to remove a tyrant from power, but to save Germany from the catastrophic consequences of continued war and moral collapse. They understood that their actions carried immense personal risk and that failure would almost certainly be fatal, yet their commitment to ethical responsibility compelled them forward. While much attention is given to military plots against the regime, the quieter, more pervasive forms of resistance among civilians and religious communities were equally critical. These acts of defiance were often hidden in plain sight, carried out by ordinary people who faced the constant threat of imprisonment, torture, or execution. In many ways, their courage was more dangerous precisely because it required navigating a society saturated with surveillance, informants, and fear. Every choice to help, protect, or speak out was an act of moral defiance, a refusal to be complicit in crimes that were escalating across Germany and occupied territories. Families, in particular, became the first line of resistance for those being persecuted. Ordinary citizens who chose to shelter Jewish neighbors, political dissidents, or others targeted by oppressive policies faced extraordinary risks. A single denunciation by a neighbor or a relative could mean the arrest of the entire household. Yet countless families made the decision to act, often quietly, sometimes relying on clandestine communication networks to coordinate safe passage or provide basic necessities. These acts of bravery were rarely recognized at the time, yet they saved lives and created a moral foundation that would outlast the war itself. Religious institutions provided both moral guidance and practical assistance. Some clergy spoke openly against policies that dehumanized groups of people, denouncing the persecution from pulpits despite the personal dangers this entailed. Others worked quietly to offer sanctuary or facilitate escape routes, often at personal great risk. The church became a conduit of ethical action, providing a moral framework in a society increasingly dominated by fear and obedience. Figures such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had already begun resistance in earlier years, continued their efforts during this period, balancing spiritual guidance with direct action to save lives and oppose injustice. Students also played a prominent role in civilian resistance. Groups like the White Rose, founded by Hans and Sophie Scholl and their fellow students in Munich, distributed leaflets that exposed atrocities and encouraged Germans to oppose oppression. Their writings combined moral reasoning with appeals to conscience, challenging the narrative propagated by the state. The White Rose members understood the stakes. They were aware that discovery meant almost certain death, but their commitment to truth and justice drove them to continue. Their courage highlights the intellectual and ethical dimensions of civilian resistance, demonstrating that opposition was not only a matter of physical risk, but also of moral integrity. Intellectuals, journalists, and writers engaged in similar forms of quiet defiance. They produced clandestine publications, wrote essays critical of the regime, and maintained correspondence with sympathetic contacts abroad. These efforts were fraught with danger. Discovery often led to imprisonment, interrogation, and even execution. Yet for these individuals, the dissemination of truth and the preservation of moral perspective were vital. Even small acts such as sharing a banned book or reading a foreign newspaper were significant gestures of resistance in a society where access to unfiltered information was tightly controlled. Resistance also took on more practical forms in daily life. Workers sometimes sabotaged production lines that supported the war effort, delayed construction of military installations, or subtly disrupted logistics. Shopkeepers, transport workers, and clerks occasionally engaged in quiet acts of obstruction, protecting civilians or hindering policies that contributed to oppression. These small acts, while seemingly inconsequential at the moment, accumulated over time, representing a persistent undercurrent of defiance that countered the regime's control. Communication was a critical component of civilian resistance. Networks of trusted individuals developed methods to share information discreetly. Messages were coded, letters were hidden, and meetings were conducted in secret. The very act of communicating outside of official channels was an assertion of independence and agency. These networks connected disparate resistors, allowing them to coordinate aid, provide moral support, and create a sense of community in a society that sought to isolate and control individuals. Ethical dilemmas were a constant reality for civilian and religious resistors. They had to weigh the potential consequences of their actions not only for themselves, but also for those around them. Sheltering a persecuted family could endanger one's own household. Distributing leaflets or writing critical essays could result in arrest and interrogation, which might harm friends or family. Each decision required a careful assessment of risk versus moral duty. The choices made by these individuals reveal the profound courage required to uphold conscience under oppressive conditions. Personal letters, diaries, and memoirs from this period reveal the emotional and moral struggles faced by civilian resistors. One diary entry from a Munich student recalls the fear of betrayal in every corridor of the university, the constant awareness that anyone could report them, yet the determination to continue distributing leaflets that exposed atrocities. A letter from a clergyman describes the agony of balancing the need to protect vulnerable parishioners with the desire to speak openly against injustice. These personal accounts give voice to the human side of resistance, illustrating the depth of commitment and the constant presence of danger. Women played a particularly significant role in civilian resistance, often acting as the organizers and caretakers of underground networks. They transported messages, hid individuals, and facilitated communication between different groups of resistors. Their contributions were vital to the functioning of clandestine operations and to the survival of those being targeted. Despite the additional societal constraints upon them, women displayed extraordinary ingenuity and courage, ensuring that resistance persisted even in the most dangerous circumstances. Religious, intellectual, and civilian resistance were often intertwined. Clergy would provide moral guidance and practical support, while students and writers spread awareness and encouraged ethical action. Families and ordinary citizens offered sanctuary, resources, and communication channels. Together, these networks created a multi-layered system of opposition that, though fragile and constantly under threat, represented a persistent refusal to accept oppression. The moral impact of civilian resistance extended beyond the immediate acts themselves. By choosing to act, even in secret, individuals affirmed the possibility of conscience and ethical agency in a society dominated by fear. They demonstrated that ordinary citizens could exercise moral responsibility even when the cost was high. These actions preserved the notion that Germany was not entirely complicit in the crimes being committed, that pockets of moral clarity existed even amid widespread conformity. Civilian and religious resistance also contributed to the preservation of truth. In an environment saturated with propaganda, maintaining access to accurate information was a powerful act. Leaflets, underground newspapers, letters, and secret radio broadcasts provided a counter-narrative to the official story. They informed people of atrocities, encouraged ethical reflection, and fostered solidarity among those willing to act. By 1945, the cumulative effect of civilian and religious resistance was significant. Although unable to halt the machinery of war or fully protect targeted populations, these networks saved countless lives, inspired courage, and left a historical record of ethical action. The stories of these resistors underscore the diversity of opposition. It was not confined to dramatic military plots or high-level conspiracies, but existed in the daily choices of ordinary people, in the courage of families, students, clergy, and workers, all committed to moral responsibility. The enduring lesson of civilian and religious resistance is clear. Courage does not always manifest on battlefields. Sometimes it emerges in quiet acts of defiance, in whispered words, in the sheltering of the vulnerable, and in the maintenance of ethical integrity against overwhelming pressure. These acts, collectively, form a tapestry of moral resistance that persisted throughout the dark years of war, illuminating the capacity of ordinary people to act with extraordinary bravery and conscience.